Work it, make it, do it, make sense.
Who wants to go on an adventure today to learn the ancient art of discovering bounded context, which we all seem to have forgot? No one. Well, you can all go, and I can go home, and that was a good talk. Thank you very much. I'll assume you just don't like putting your hands up. So I'm going to take you on this adventure. But are we going to find the bounded context treasure? Or are we going to run into danger? So it's not a safe journey I'm going to take you on. So I had to do lots of research about these bounded context things and work out, we've been using them in DDD for like 10 years, and now suddenly all you lot are searching for them. So why? Why did you start searching for them over the past few years? Why did you suddenly start caring about them? We've loved them for years, and now you lot come along and like, oh, we're going to take these bounded context things. Why? Anyone? Why did you start liking bounded contexts? Anyone? It's okay, I know the answer. You don't need to tell me. I did some research. I was checking out the news from April 2013. It was Justin Bieber. Justin Bieber's new haircut sent people bounded context crazy. It's the only answer I can possibly find to explain this craze. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe we need to have a chat with Uncle Adrian Cockcroft, telling us we must be creating these fine-grained microservices that implement bounded context. Maybe it was experts like him and Sam Newman, good old Sam Newman, aligning bounded context and microservices. So bounded contexts have become very popular. We're all searching for them. But there's a bit of a problem. You don't know what they are. You can't agree amongst yourself what these bounded context things are. Who's seen this conversation before? Bounded contexts exist in the real world. No, that's subdomains. No, yes, you're an idiot. I'm taking my toys back. Well, how about this one? There should be a one-to-one mapping between microservices and bounded contexts. Why is everyone so obsessed with this one-to-one mapping between microservices and bounded contexts? No one can agree on anything. How about this one? Bounded contexts don't own the UI. Yes, they do. Whatever. So I wonder, have these bounded context things just become a bit of a buzzword? And people like to use them to make themselves feel clever. Oh yes, we're using bounded context and that DDD stuff. We're doing it all right. I think they have become a bit of a buzzword, but there is some useful stuff in there. But before we get to the useful stuff, I need to warn you. You can't just go around calling anything a bounded context, because you're going to have problems. And last year, I was at a user group in London giving a talk about digital transformation. One of the things I was talking about was, create these small things, nice and independent, bounded context, blah, blah, blah. It was quite a good talk, actually. Got to the end of the talk, everyone was asking me loads of questions, the pizza had gone cold. I was quite happy with my night's work. People normally don't put their hands up, like today. They don't ask me questions or anything, like today. But this was a good talk. And after the talk, this guy comes up to me. He says, "Hey, Nick, I'm a dev manager for company blah, blah. We were having that kind of problem you talked about, the bounded context." He said, 6 months ago, it was taking so long to implement even the most basic feature in our code base. So my developers, they asked for 6 months to take their big monolith and break it down into these small bounded context things. And I said to him, okay, that's a lot of companies going through that nowadays. Do you break it all down in one big rewrite or smaller pieces? That's a kind of tough question. And he was like, no, you don't understand. I let them do it, and now the work is taking 3 times longer. The developers are always fighting, and the execs are going nuts at me. I've got 3 months to save my job. What should I do? Enjoy the free pizza? Didn't have an answer for him. So you can get in trouble if you go around using bounded context and microservices and you don't really understand what they are. I'm not saying you'll lose your job like he probably did. I wonder if he's here. That would be quite embarrassing, wouldn't it? No, he's not here, I don't think. So yeah, there's a lot of, you can go wrong with these things. So I want to show you how to find bounded context. And it doesn't start with code or anything like that. It starts by understanding the business problem. So before we can, imagine I just read that out to you. It starts by understanding the business problem. So a couple of things I teach on my workshop are the business model canvas. Understand your organization's business model, the value propositions, the customer segments, the key activities and the key resources. And those things will tell you what's important. And then when you're looking for bounded context, you have an anchor point. We're creating bounded context to satisfy this goal. But it's not just enough to understand the fuzzy business stuff. You also need to understand which are the core use cases in your system that your users care about. Who here is doing user research in their organization? Shame on the rest of you. If you don't understand what your users are saying, you cannot possibly create software that is satisfying their needs. You can't possibly prioritize your time and energy creating bounded context to satisfy their needs because you don't even know what they're asking for. But I won't hold it against you, and I won't hold it against you that you didn't put your hands up earlier. We're going to move on to the next part. So we've started understanding the business. We've started understanding our users. And we begin by looking at those core use cases. We find where value is, and we start there. So you can create user stories. You can start at the whiteboard by talking about things. But it's about finding the core use case. So I'm going to talk to you about this domain I worked in when I worked in the government. I've had to rename a few of the words so I don't get sued. But it's basically, as a business, you can log into this system and you can review information held about your properties and how that's used to work out how much tax you pay. If you're not happy, you can amend details and you can resubmit details, and if you can renegotiate how much tax you pay. So in this system, we've identified the core use case. Customers care about renegotiating their tax because everyone wants to pay less tax, let me tell you. So we think of the system as a black box. We think about it from the perspective of our users. And that's when the interesting stuff happens. Then we can start doing DDD. If you don't know this stuff and you're doing DDD, yeah, you're doing it wrong. Sorry. So we start thinking about the system from the inside now and how the domain actually works. But again, we start with our user. What are they trying to achieve in this core use case? In this case, I'm an overpaying ratepayer. The first thing I want to do is review the information held about my businesses so I can check if it's correct or not. And this is where we get to the interesting part of modeling. Now you want to work out, okay, well, which bounded context is responsible for enabling this action to happen? Where does this responsibility live? So you'll be at the whiteboard with your domain expert, waving your arms and putting post-it notes everywhere. You'll be doing all that stuff. And you'll be trying to work out which context does this belong to. And in this domain, the obvious solution we went to is, okay, we'll name it after the business process step. So we're like, okay, this is handled by the assessment review context. But you can't say context to like a domain expert because it means nothing to them. So you're kind of talking about these things and it's difficult. So what you can do is just start with a bubble or just put the name of the step. So here we're calling it the assessment review step. We're not calling it a context, we're calling it step. And then you say, okay, well, we've got this assessment review step. How do the assessments get in there? And then the domain experts start going off into all their lovely speak, and they're like, we contact a surveyor, we send them out to the property, they assess the property, they supply us all the information. Fantastic. What happens next? Well, I'm a ratepayer, I see the information's incorrect, and I resubmit it. I don't have 200 car parking spaces, I don't even have any car parking spaces. Great. So which context owns this? And again, you can't say to the domain expert, well, which context owns this, because there is no context. So you're like, okay, what shall we call this step? Let's call it the attribute resubmit. And the domain expert's like, no, we don't call it attribute resubmit. That's too many words. We just call it resubmit. So in this domain, the word resubmit means to resubmit some property attributes that you think are incorrect. And then we're like, fantastic. What happens next? Let's have a coffee and come back to it. You have a coffee, you come back. What happens next? A case is created. Tell me more about this case. Well, it's sent to the case management team. And we're like, okay, well, we'll create this context and we'll call it case management for now. At this point, it's just a hypothesis. You're not committing to any context yet. And then you're like, okay, well, what happens next? Well, the caseworker comes along. They've got 14 days to process it. How do they process the case? They send the surveyor back to the property to check the details, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to stop here, because that's not the full use case, but I think you get the idea, right? You're trying to guess at these bounded contexts, and you might name them after steps, the assessment review step, or you might name them after a team, the case management team. And then you go through more of these use cases, you create different use case diagrams, or you sketch different use cases on the wall, and you look at all these different use cases, and you try and work out the context you'll need. And I'll talk about that in a sec. But then you'll come back to a context map. So you're going to take all those different use cases, you're going to abstract them away into a context map, which is still just a guess at this point. You're not committing to any context. And during that process, you can use clues to find bounded contexts. So the first one is language. If you've read the Big Blue Book by Eric, he's absolutely obsessed by language and precision and using words. And it's a very good thing to help us find these contexts. So what this means is, in your domain, you look for words and phrases that are used together. Or you look for the same word, which has different meanings in different places. So in this example, when we're in the resubmit context, we're talking about property attributes, floor space, air conditioning, car parks, physical attributes. But when we're in the renegotiate context, now we're talking about I want to pay less tax and this tax band and that tax band and this rating and stuff. The language is completely different. So those boundaries look quite clean and separated. But then we get to the case management, and it's a bit awkward because we're reusing language from the other contexts. When you create a resubmit case, it contains language about resubmits. When you create a renegotiate case, it contains language about renegotiates. So that context it's not obvious, and you're not quite sure, so you think, okay, let's look at the other clues. Another clue is data. If I've got data in this context, and I want to make a change to it, but have to change some data in another context, that dependency is a warning that got a dependency, coupling, might not be good boundaries. Maybe we can turn those things into one context. Another is domain expert boundaries. What does this mean? It means that in a large, complicated problem domain, you might have different domain experts, and they will care about different things. And what they care about can give you clues about good, clean boundaries. So, for example, in this domain, when I'm in resubmits, the domain expert here is a surveyor. Goes around to properties, collects all the attributes, drinks lots of coffee and stretches the day out. But when you get to renegotiate, the domain expert now is someone who deals with tax bans and finance and politics, different domain expert. So it's telling us those boundaries, that the resubmit and the renegotiate, they look quite clean and they satisfy these clues. But then we get to case management and it's like, well, yeah, both of those domain experts have to have an impact in case management. They both have to provide input. So maybe case management isn't a good boundary. We talked about existing organizational boundaries, can be useful, can be a bit of a red herring, and we've also got business process steps. In some domains, to find your context, you just take your business process step, chop it up into you take your business process, you chop it up into steps, and each step is a context. It really is that easy sometimes. So we've got here, review, resubmit, renegotiate, and case management. Only the problem with this is, you think it's a business process step. When you start modeling it, and when you start implementing it in software, it's a bit more than just a business process step. And you crack it open and you see multiple different responsibilities. And that's where this organization kind of went wrong. They created these contexts in a high-level strategy document by some senior executives who get nowhere near the code. But when they went to implement it, they found that, yeah, case management is two things. It's processing the resubmit case, and it's processing the renegotiate case. So it's not really satisfying any of these clues. So what we get to now is the tricky part, and this is why it's an art and not a science, because these clues are telling us case management, it's not a clean boundary. Do we need it or don't we need it? And this is what DDD helps us to do. DDD helps us to create these different models, encourages us to look for different models of the same domain. But then we have to choose which is the right model for us to choose. And this is where a lot of people go wrong with DDD. They can't justify why they're using it. Why are you creating a bounded context? Why are you creating pretty models? I read it in a book. Someone told me at a conference I need to create bounded contexts. That's not really going to make much difference to your manager or someone who's not into code. I'm sure I clicked that. So how do we justify these bounded contexts? And how do we know which model to choose? It's probably not something your customers care about. So they're not going to say, oh yeah, we're going to pick this organization because those developers, I read their blog and they've got these amazing bounded contexts. Feel free to prove me wrong on that. You can call me out anytime. But what we need to think about is at a higher level. So let's think about the organizational factor. So we've got this context map. Now let's think about the teams that own the context. So here we've got one team that owns each context. That's a good thing because they own specific parts of the domain. They have knowledge and expertise and ownership. But this organization has a few problems. We've got a lot of friction here. So the case management team, they're going crazy. The resubmit team and the renegotiate team keep firing changes at them. When one of those teams adds a new form to their field, it has to be updated on the case management system. But the case management team, they have their own priorities and they can't keep up. And so the resubmit team and the renegotiate, they're now being blocked by the case management team. So we have an organizational problem here. And this is where we look at our different models, the model with the case management and the model without it. And we use organizational factors like this to justify which is the best model. So in this case, we can fix that problem by choosing contexts that look like this. And actually, these contexts suit our clues much better. So think about language here. When I'm talking about resubmit, I'm not sharing that language with case management. It's all nicely encapsulated in resubmit. Same for renegotiate. How about when I want to add a text box onto a web page? Well, I can update the front end, and the same team owns the full slice, so they can update the back end. No dependency on other teams. Now, the approach we're using here is composite applications. And what this means is, so we don't want to compromise the user experience. That we still have to focus on this. But what a composite application means is, I'm a user, I'm looking at one web page, I click on a link, I go to another page. The first web page is served up by one context, but the second web page is served up by another. A lot of people think we have all of these domain-driven design APIs, but monolithic web front ends. It's really not true. Your bounded contexts can contain the UI. And in most cases, they probably should. Where was I? So that leads me to, why do we not have one big piece of software? Why do we not have one team all working in the same code base? Because it just doesn't scale. You'd have everyone tripping over each other, blocking each other, getting in each other's way. No work would get done. And that's why. That's why we create boundaries in the first place. We create these boundaries so people can have isolation and the ability to just get on with writing stuff without being dependent. So when we start talking about bounded context and microservices and people start throwing all of these different rules and patterns at us, there's only one thing we have to really care about, and that's delivering software faster. So when you're finding boundaries, that's the only thing I think you should care about. Everything else is just trying to help you achieve this. And so what we get to now is we start tripping into the world of theory of constraints. Has anyone heard of this? So theory of constraints is this set of principles that came out of manufacturing in the 1980s. And it basically says, in any organization, the limiting factor on delivering faster, there will be bottlenecks. And if your organization has a bottleneck, the way to be more productive is to fix the bottleneck. If you fix something else, but the bottleneck's still there, you're not going to improve anything. And so that's what we're doing with DDD. We're using bounded contexts to fix the bottlenecks. And that's what we did here. We saw problems in the organization. They were bottlenecks. And we used bounded context to remove those bottlenecks. And so this is my workflow. This is how I do SOA, microservices, bounded context, whatever we call it. I use DDD. I use those clues about language and data and domain experts. I use those clues to get all these different ideas for models, but I use theory of constraints to look for bottlenecks to choose the best model. And that's how I advise you to think about things. Don't just think about DDD and bounded context as these low-level coding patterns. It goes much higher all the way through your organization. Bounded context should allow you to deliver software more frequently. And this is where people start getting clever. And they say to me, yeah, this is great. We have all of these nicely independent bounded contexts and all these teams that are nice and autonomous, blah, blah, blah. But that won't work, because what if you get your boundaries wrong? How are you going to fix it then if you have all these teams who aren't talking to each other? I never said any of that stuff. Your boundaries do have to change. Your boundaries will always change. You'll be working on some code, and you'll work out, yeah, this doesn't fit into our model. Doesn't really fit. These concepts don't seem to work together. It's not a clean fit. And you'll realize that another team, you need to combine your model back with their model and then break it up in a separate way once you've added the new concepts. Or you'll find out that you'll see bottlenecks forming in your organization. You might think you've got these beautiful, clean, bounded contexts. You spend hours crafting them and going through all these different use cases. You're convinced that these are the best bounded contexts in the world and you can't do any better. But if there's a bottleneck in your organization, maybe the answer is to reshape your bounded context to eliminate the bottleneck. So you can't just look at the code and those clues. You have to align it with bottlenecks. And I was at a talk the other day by Matt Skelton, and he's saying this kind of thing. So as teams go through different stages, sometimes you want teams who do have autonomy, but sometimes you need teams working closely together when you're exploring new parts of the domain. And so this has an impact on your bounded contexts. So let me give you an example. So one of these examples is your bounded context can grow and multiply. I was going to say like a baby, but babies don't multiply, do they? Would that be a weird analogy? Can I say that? Can you edit that bit out, please? So anyway, this is a domain I once worked in. It was about music streaming and downloading. Worked in this organization. You've got a web store, you can buy music, you can download it, etc. Now at the start, when the company was quite small, we had this discovery context. And it had a couple of responsibilities. It allowed you to search for music so you can find artists and tracks and albums that you want to buy and download. But then when you found the one you like, you can look it up. So this context enabled you to search and look things up. As the business started to grow, search became a bit more important. Search became more important, and that part of the system started to grow. So it split out into a search context and a catalog context. And then later, The business changed its priorities. It's like, oh no, our competitors all have amazing recommendations. If we don't implement recommendations and beat the other companies, we'll be nowhere. So we had to spit out a new context just for recommendations, so the business could iterate on recommendations very quickly without being slowed down by teams working on other pieces like search and catalog that weren't so important. So again, if something's core to the business, if there's a specific piece where you need to iterate quickly, that's another reason you can have bounded contexts and team sizes. And then you get to this stage where you've got different bounded contexts and different teams own them, and it can get a bit complicated. So I work at Salesforce. Please don't hate me. I work at Salesforce. We've got like 25,000 employees. Got hundreds, maybe thousands of developers. Quite a few salespeople as well, but they're all nice. So we have this big system. It's not possible for every team to know about every single other team. It just doesn't scale. So you have to find cohesion, and you have to find out which of these contexts and which of these teams need to work together. And you have to make it easy for them to collaborate. So in this example, recommendations and search, they were involved quite closely in different use cases. But in the organization, those things didn't really interact with payments a lot. So even when you find these bounded contexts and you've got great boundaries, you still need to work out where the cohesion is to enable collaboration between those teams. Think about it like countries. You've got towns, counties, countries, galaxies, different levels of abstraction. You need to find at each level the things that need to work together. So here's one for you. I'm going to talk about Salesforce now. So I work in the marketing cloud at Salesforce. I help people to put adverts on the internet, which is something else you might want to hate me for. Please don't. Not the horrible ads that start playing noise at you, the nice ads. Anyway, we have these two contexts. One is called the management context. It enables you to create advertising campaigns, set up A/B tests, etc., place bids, change how much you want to bid, etc. But we also have the optimization context. This context goes out, collects lots of stats, does artificial intelligence, all that fancy stuff, and it tells you, yeah, this ad's performing really well, spend more money here. This one, yeah, it's not doing too well, forget about that, kill it, save your money, put the money over here. So we have these two separate contexts and these two teams who are nice and independent and iterating very quickly. And then one day, the business came along with a great idea. We've been looking at the numbers and we can see this market, they're spending X billion pounds a year. We think we can build an exciting product in this area. No one else can build this product because we're Salesforce and we have special ways to do it. We need you to build an MVP over the next 3 months. We're going to test out this idea, get some feedback, and if it's good, we'll invest more time and energy into it. Which is great. You want to work for ambitious companies who have great ideas. But then it came back to the teams, and they're like, well, who's going to build this MVP then? Because it's got bits of management in there, and it's got bits of optimization stuff in there. DDD people, keeping our clean boundaries. Yep, clean boundaries. You're not affecting our model. And then you've got the Agile people. Well, we want one team who can iterate very quickly, can't afford to have two teams collaborating. Who wins, DDD or Agile? Who's voting for DDD? Who's voting for Agile? Damn, you're right. But you're not right, because that's the wrong comparison to make. DDD's never been about keeping these clean models and not compromising. That's absolutely not what it's about. So what we did here is, we said, yeah, iteration speed is the most important thing here. We have to iterate quickly, get some feedback, work out if this product is a good idea, and then we can think about later on scaling it up and breaking it back out into separate models. But what we did do is we said, okay, a couple of people from each team, you can build the MVP, but these two teams, you're now using Spotify terminology, you're now a tribe. So these two teams are going to work closely together. Both teams are going to understand this MVP. So when it does grow and it does scale, they'll have the knowledge to break it back down into different contexts or maybe new contexts. So what we're saying is, these two teams are now going to iterate a bit slower because they're going to collaborate more. But that's important here because discovery is important. We'd rather have two teams going slowly in the right direction than going fast in the wrong direction. Okay, another question for you. Since you answered the last couple of questions, I'm feeling good about this one. How do you create alignment between your teams? Anyone want to guess? So if there's one thing you take away from this conference, if there's one thing you go back to work on Monday and tell your boss you need to be doing, you need to be telling them, I want to play more video games. That Nick Tune guy, he told me, if we play more video games, our teams will be more aligned and we will be more productive. 100% scientifically proven. That was a good day, that was. We were playing Mario Kart, having a retro N64 day. It's pretty cool. By the way, if anyone likes to play games, I invite you to come up and join us at the Salesforce Tower, where we play games in between doing lots of hard work. But there are other things you can do. So show and tells is a good way. So the point here is, whether you're doing discovery or not, you need to understand how your model fits into the rest of the system. Because like we talked about, these boundaries will evolve. And so you need to understand what other teams are working on. Show and tells are a really good way to do this. So at the end of each iteration, you should try and do a show and tell. And it doesn't mean you have to go to every other team. But if you're doing show and tells, you can be talking about your business priorities, your user research, and how that's changed your domain model. And other teams may come to your show and tell and realize, well, we're working on something very similar to that. We should be collaborating with this team more. So show and tells enable networks to form. And that's how you get insights about your boundaries needing to change. It's happened to me a few times. Something else you can do is cross-team pairing. So go and spend a couple of days working in another team, just pair up with a developer, work on their parts of the domain, and that will help you to build up this big picture of how your model fits into the overall picture. It gives you a wider understanding of all the different pieces. You can also try cross-functional pairing, and this helps you to get a deeper knowledge. So go and work with a product manager or a business analyst and understand more about the business priorities and that side of things. And when you have all this information about business priorities and what other teams are working on, that allows you to think strategically. You can see across different teams, and you can suggest ways to realign your teams and realign your software. If your team's got problems and your model's not clean and you're being blocked by other teams, if you only say you're having problems, people tend not to listen to you. If you can say, look, we're having this problem, we're being blocked all the time, I know this team has this part of code in the mod, I know this team has this part of the model in their code. If we can realign these two teams, we can fix it. But you can only say that if you understand what other teams are working on. And something else is event storming. Has anyone heard of event storming? It's that thing where you put lots of Post-its on the wall. It looks really cool in the pictures, and it is actually quite cool if you get a chance to do it. So the point with event storming is, again, we want to map out as much of the system, as much of the domain as we possibly can, spanning across many or all of our teams. And when we see it all laid out, we can see optimizations, we can see where our model fits into the overall picture. And that helps us to work out when our boundaries can be improved. So with all of this in mind, I want to propose a different way of thinking about bounded contexts. And I said something similar to this at Domain-Driven Design Europe. And guess who came up to me after the talk? Eric Evans. I'm like, you didn't like that, did you? And he went, no. So he doesn't like it. This isn't approved DDD stuff. This is me freestyling it. So what I think is that bounded context, they're a proxy heuristic for autonomy. So when we're talking about language that's used together, when we're talking about data that's used together, We're trying to create autonomy by removing dependencies in the software, and removing dependencies between teams so we can deliver software faster. So I think of them as autonomy contexts. So what I'm trying to do here is find things that change together for business reasons. I'm thinking about business capabilities, specific products, or specific parts of a product. We then want to get all of the different technical pieces needed to deliver that capability inside this boundary. So like we were talking about, you can have UI in there if you want to. And finally, it's all owned by a single team. So this team can iterate very quickly now. We can take new ideas, implement them quickly, and put them in front of customers and get feedback, because we don't have any dependencies. And for me, that's the goal of bounded context. But like I told you, it's not Eric's goal. So here's what you probably should take away from this talk if you don't take away the video gaming thing. If you want to be, you should take away the video gaming thing, but yeah, each to your own. So to be good with DDD, if you want to create bounded contexts that are truly useful, that provide some purpose to your organization has to be in the right shape. So you need to be good at saying, yeah, I want to create this model in code, and I need the organization, the teams, to be structured in this way. Here's a quote that says that much better than I ever could. And basically, if you want to be good, if you want to create these great models in your code, if you want to be effective with DDD, if your organization isn't structured in the right way, you can't be. You've lost already. So you have to fix the organization first, or at least work on it. So here are some things I think you should do. So experiment with models. Don't think about DDD as this way of creating a perfect model, modeling the real world. Forget about those things. Just use those clues and look for different models. The model with the case management, the model without the case management, etc. Create lots of ideas. And learn about theory of constraints. This is how you can justify your bounded context. You can say, yeah, I've got this model. It eliminates bottlenecks in our organization. We can deliver software faster. Justify your choices, yeah, so you can deliver software faster. And alignment, like we were talking about. You don't really just find bounded context and that's it, your model's perfect, because your boundaries will evolve. As you learn more about the code, as business priorities change, your boundaries need to evolve. So you, personally, you need to have a broader understanding of what's happening in other teams. So you know when the models need to change. So event storming, cross-team pairing, etc. So we're almost finished now. The pain is almost over. Did we find the treasure? So I just want to tell you about someone who did all this stuff. If you want to find the treasure, do what this guy did. So back at the start of my career, I was working for a lot of companies where I'm just having meetings all the time. I'm not getting any work done. And I'm thinking to myself, seriously, serious, true story. I'm thinking to myself, I don't really want to work in IT. I don't really want to work in software. I mean, I love coding. I just don't get to do any of it. I seriously don't get to do hardly any coding, all this politics and meetings. It's driving me mad. But then I heard about this company, and they were doing continuous delivery. They had open source code on GitHub. This was a long time ago when GitHub was just starting. And they had this cool manager. So I'm like, hey, can I come and work for you? And the manager was like, sorry, Nick, if you come back in a few months, we might have a job for you. Like, he could see the passion in my eyes. He didn't want to shatter my dreams right there and then. He thought, if I can get rid of this kid for a few months, yeah, he won't come back. But I didn't take his hint, and I did come back in a few months. I'm like, hey, can I come and work for you now? And he's like, oh, no, he came back. What do I do now? He's like, Nick, can you come back in a few more months? I'm like, what about if I have an interview now, and then when you are hiring, I can work for you? He's like, oh, he looks so awkward. He didn't want to, I'm like a little puppy looking at him, and he's like, I can't shatter this boy's dreams. So he's like, okay, you can have an interview, Nick. So I had an interview, first stage, and I passed. And I had a second stage interview, and I passed. And suddenly he's like, oh, Nick, when can you start? Suddenly he had a job for me straight there and then. But that's not the story. Basically, when I started working at this company, on my first day, I paired up with this senior engineer. We wrote some code. After lunch, we had a glass of orange juice. We clicked a button and we deployed that code into production. Wow. I wrote code and I deployed it in one day. No meetings, no hassles, none of that rubbish stuff. And like 6 months later, I'm doing this every day and I'm just thinking to myself, this is unbelievable. Like no other company, they're like years and years behind this. And so I started asking people, how did you get to be this good? How did you make things like this? And some people were just like, I've been here a year, I'm still trying to get used to it myself, it's unbelievable. But one person said to me, oh yeah, it was the manager. He started here as a developer about a few years ago. He started talking about this DDD stuff and theory of constraint stuff. And we started doing it. We started reshaping our boundaries and reorganizing our teams. And that's how we got here. I'm like, wow. And that's when I started going DDD and theory of constraints mad, learning about all those things. But that manager, he is now, true story, 100% true story, that manager, he is now the head of technology at a huge organization, and they've got businesses in different industries. And he started out by applying this stuff and just fixing his organization. And all of you have that opportunity. So I think that's the treasure you should be looking for. Use DDD and use bounded context to transform your organization, not just to create pretty models in your code. And you can. Just remember one thing. The art of discovering bounded context, like reading lesson at school, the art of discovering bounded context is the art of aligning organizational and technical boundaries. Quotes, Eric Evans doesn't agree with this. We're finished. Thank you.